Okay, well, as you guys know, we have an exhibit that's on display right now at Booth Library. It'll be there till April 9th. If you haven't seen it yet, I know you will, because you will need to do that before you help out with the 5th graders. We had several programs related to this that took place over the last 2 weeks. So you might hear me mention some of those. They are over now, but 2 weeks ago, a little south of here in Crawford County, because the Parkers, as you will find out in a little bit, were some of the first settlers there, I gave this presentation that I'm about ready to give to you. And then Friday, Saturday, and Monday this past weekend, we had several others. We had many, many, many Parker family descendants who attended from Missouri, Indiana, and all over Illinois, so that was pretty exciting. So we will move on. Our exhibit is called The History and the Legend. So first I'm going to talk about the history, then I'll explain why we added the legend to this. I know it's not easy to see who all of these people are, but this is a family tree of Elder John Parker. You can see he's up there at the top. 13 children Elder John and his wife Sarah had, which was pretty unusual back in the late 1700s, early 1800s to have 13 children grow to adulthood. So you see them all laid out here. I just want to point out, because you're going to be hearing me mention several of these people as we progress here. The oldest here, Daniel, supposedly was named after Daniel Boone because he was good friends with Elder John Parker. He was a preacher who settled in the Crawford County, Robinson, Palestine area, and I don't know where you guys are from, so you might not know where that is, but maybe you do. The Parkers were Baptists. Elder John was a preacher, his oldest son Daniel was a preacher, his son James here was a preacher, and so they established some of the first Baptist churches, not only here in Illinois, but also in Texas. You'll hear me talk about that more later. Benjamin over here, he is the first official settler of Coles County. So way back before Coles County was Coles County, you guys know where Lake Charleston is outside of town here and where the spillway is, the dam. Right along that area is the Imbara River, and that's all that was there when they came here. First white settlers, so only Indians lived here before that. He built the first cabin, created a mill there, so if you look at the Coles County history books, he is considered to be the first Coles County settler. Isak here was a brother who was very influential both here in Illinois and Texas. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. James is another brother who's very influential to our story. Nathaniel and Silas, and I'll explain the importance of these people. You notice it was mostly the men I'm talking about here. A lot of the daughters, some lived here, some stayed behind when they moved from place to place. And where did they come from? Here's the map. Elder John Parker was a 2-time Revolutionary War veteran. You can see, started out on the East Coast as most of our ancestors did when they came over from Europe. Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, before they finally ended up moving to Texas. So they were among many colonial families at the time who, for some reason that I can't grasp or understand, felt the need to constantly move further west. Elder John especially. Why, we may never know, partly because of their religious background and they wanted to spread the word of God. They never stayed anywhere for more than 3 to 8 years before they picked up, and I mean everybody picked up. You saw how many people there were. As they went along, the families got bigger. Neighbors sometimes joined along, so there would be big groups, large groups of people who would move from place to place to place. Texas was their last stop, and you'll find out why here in a minute. So just to explain a little bit, the Parkers who were here over the weekend were especially interested in this information because these are their ancestors we're talking about. What I want you guys to take away from this information is just how influential the Parkers were, not only in Illinois, but also in Texas. Elder John, as I said, 2 stints in the Revolutionary War. His oldest, Daniel, very controversial preacher of his day. Some people believed everything that he had to say, and some people believed nothing that he had to say. So like with most churches, the Baptist church was sort of split at the time. He was a predestinarian Baptist. believed in the controversial two-seedism doctrine, which is very complicated, but long story short, we're either the seeds of God or we're the seeds of the devil, and there's nothing that we can do about it. It was basically what he believed. He published a newspaper. He organized the Pilgrim Predestinarian Regular Baptist Church in Illinois. So at some point, after they'd been in Illinois for a while, just like they had every time before, they decided it was time to move on, time to move to Texas. Texas at the time wasn't Texas, or it wasn't a part of the United States anyway. It was still part of Mexico. The story goes, Mexico was offering free land in the Texas area for a couple of reasons. The most important reason is they wanted a buffer between them and the Indians, because Comanche Indians and a lot of the other Indian tribes were causing a lot of violence down there. So they offered free land to some unsuspecting colonials like the Parkers, who moved to Texas. Unfortunately, because it was controlled by Mexico, they would only allow Catholic churches to be formed there. That was a problem for the Parkers. They believed Catholics were evil and they only wanted to establish Baptist churches. So Stephen Austin and some of the other officials at the time, Austin, Texas, who it was named after, they said, if you already have a church that is formed and you bring it with you to Texas, we'll let you keep it, but you can't form a new church in Texas. So he just went back to Illinois and formed this church so that he could move everybody down with him. So he took his congregation and everybody and moved to Texas. And the Baptist church that he created, I'm told, is still there, and the congregation is still going after all this time. Benjamin Parker, like I said, the first official Coles County resident. He also was very influential in creating Charleston and Coles County for a variety of reasons. One of the exhibits that we have on display over there is called The Parkers in Coles County. And it shows some of the ways the Parkers were influential. Benjamin and a lot of his brothers owned most of the land where the courthouse here in Charleston now sits. Benjamin donated the land, along with Charles Morton, for whom Charleston is named, donated the land so that the courthouse could be built, and was instrumental in making sure Charleston was the county seat of Coles County once it was formed. Isak, sheriff of Clark County. Now this gets confusing because this was Clark County at one time. When the Parkers first moved here in 1816 or 1817, this was actually Crawford County. Crawford County went from Robinson, which is an hour and a half south of here, all the way to Chicago, where Chicago is now. Like most of the central and northern Illinois was Crawford County. Officially, it was Crawford County when they came. In 1819, it became Clark. Isak was one of the first, maybe the first sheriff of Clark. And then in 1831, it became Coles County. So he was influential here, sheriff, justice of the peace, county treasurer. Then after they moved to Texas, you can see he has a big political background there. Senator, the Parkers were very involved in Texas, its independence from Mexico, it becoming its own little nation, and then later becoming part of the United States. Most of them, the ones that didn't die young, most of them were involved in all of that. Oh, I forgot, there's a picture of him. We don't have a picture of very many of the Parkers because this was so long ago, but because he lived to adulthood, we were able to find a picture of him. James, you'll hear more about James later because he is the inspiration for the movie The Searchers. So I will talk about that in a little while. James and his brother Silas, and Silas was Cynthia Ann's dad, they were the official founders of Fort Parker, Texas, which is where much of the story is going to take place. They also were some of the first Texas Rangers. I'll put Silas up there as well. So among other things, the Parkers were among the very first Texas Rangers that there ever were. Silas reluctantly, he didn't really want to do it, but he was put in charge of keeping the violence in check around Fort Parker. You'll find out that he didn't do very well at his job, unfortunately. But again, James was also a representative, was involved in politics down there. And finally, Nathaniel, the only brother who did not move to Texas. So most of the Parkers that I've met over the last year are descendants of either Nathaniel or Benjamin. Benjamin, the first official Coles County settler, he also had 12 or 13 kids with him here in Charleston, and then his wife died. The three oldest of his children were on their own by that point. He decided he wanted to go to Texas with the rest of his family, so he dropped off, I wanted to say dumped off, his younger 9 children with Nathaniel and his wife and went to Texas. So I feel sorry for Nathaniel's wife because they already had several children of their own. Then they took in 9 children of Benjamin. So most of the people that I have met who from this part of the world are descendants of either Benjamin or Nathaniel. You can see that Nathaniel in his own right was very influential. Charles, a commissioner involved in the construction of the Coles County Courthouse, named president of a special committee to create the railroad, which was a big deal back in the day to create a railroad through this area. Successful farmer, businessman, and an Illinois state senator for almost 20 years. And that's a picture. I'm sorry, I went too fast. I think he kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln myself. But anyway. And the Parkers were here at the same time as Abraham Lincoln in Charleston. I'm guessing they knew each other, but I don't know. Okay, so, like many other colonial families, if it wasn't for the Parkers moving to Texas and what happened there, we probably wouldn't be standing up here talking about them and what made them so important to today. As I told you before, most of the Parkers moved to Texas, except for Nathaniel. There was a lot of violence from Comanche Indians. They did go ahead and create Fort Parker. However, 2 of the brothers thought this land where they created it, which is near Waco, where Waco, Texas is today, it was just too dangerous. They didn't want to bring their families to live. So Daniel, the oldest, the preacher, and Isak, the one that was the first sheriff here, they said, nope, we're not going to settle in Fort Parker. They took their families further east in Texas away from where the Indians were. So you'll see, this was sort of the outline of what Fort Parker looked like in 1836, which is when the raid took place that impacted Cynthia Ann Parker's life. You can see James Parker, Silas Parker. All of these other people, names that you see up there are either their neighbors from Illinois that they brought along with them, or a lot of them are in-laws. So their children would marry, and then they would bring along the in-laws when they would move from place to place. They set up this fort right along the Navasota River. The raid, May 19th, 1836. I said earlier that we have very sketchy details of what happened before this. There weren't really good records being kept in the early 1800s, so it's hard to establish a lot of this. But what happened at Fort Parker on May 19th, 1836 is well documented because several people were there and several people told the story and wrote it down. At the time, there were 41 people living at Fort Parker, including James, Silas, Elder John, and Benjamin. Elder John and Benjamin aren't on the map because they came a little later, and at that time there was no more free land, but they were living with their brothers, so they were there. On this particular day, there hadn't been a lot of trouble with the Indians lately, so they were kind of lax. They left the doors to Fort Parker open. Most of the men went off to their nearby farms and was working the land. So at the time that the raid took place, there was only 6 men who stayed home, 8 women, and 16 children. 5 of those 16 were under the age of 1. So you can imagine what this looked like. It was mostly women and children who were there at the time. This is what Fort Parker, in theory, looks like. You can visit it today. They have restored it down in Texas, and this is a picture of what it looks like today. Killed on the raid were Elder John, Benjamin, Silas, Samuel Frost, Robert Frost. One of the men, George Dwight, and many of the women and children escaped. So what happened was a couple of dozen to several dozen to maybe a couple of hundred, depending on what you read, of Comanche, Caddo, and other Indians appeared outside the fort. Of course, all of the people inside the fort already started to panic. Benjamin, the first Coles County settler, he went out to talk to the Indians first. So he went outside the fort, asked them what they wanted. They, through hand signals, indicated that they wanted a beef, a cow. He didn't think that's what they were really there for, but he said, okay, what he was really doing was buying time so that most of the women and children could escape out the back. He came back up, talked to his father and his brother Silas and some of the other men who were there. As many as possible snuck out the back. The story goes, I tried to get him not to go back out to talk to the Indians again, but he did. He went back out and he was the first one to be killed and scalped on the spot. As soon as they saw that, the people inside the fort, of course, got their guns and there was a battle. They were well overtaken by the Indians. There were so many more Native Americans there than there were whites. So you can see, most of the Parkers who were so influential here in Coles County were killed. The ones that didn't get away were kidnapped. They weren't killed, they were kidnapped. And this is who was kidnapped. Rachel Parker Plummer, that is Cynthia Ann Parker's cousin. Her son, James Pratt Plummer, who was 2. Rachel's aunt, Elizabeth Duty Kellogg, and Cynthia Ann Parker and her brother John. Cynthia Ann was 8 or 9 at the time, and her brother was 6 or 7. Both children of Silas, who was just killed at the same time. So the search begins. I told you earlier we would talk about James Parker. He is the inspiration for the movie The Searchers. He was one of the people who were at the farm when the raid took place. So one of the adult males on site, and some of the older children, of course, ran immediately to the farms to let them know what was going on at Fort Parker, and they got back as quickly as could. Too late. There was nothing left of Fort Parker when they got there. People were killed. Everything was burned to the ground. There was nothing left to be found when they arrived. James Parker wrote his story, so primary source material here for you. Narrative of the perilous adventures, miraculous escapes, and sufferings of Reverend James W. Parker. And I stopped there, but the title goes on and on and on and on from there. You can kind of tell from the title. It's a little out of this world, and I can't say that you can believe everything that he had written. However, he did write about what happened at Fort Parker, and he, of course, felt very guilty about what happened because he was one of them who talked his family into moving to Texas, and then he wasn't there. He dedicated the next several years of his life trying to find his family members who were kidnapped, which is his daughter, his grandson, his sister-in-law, his niece, and his nephew. 5 captives. Within 2 years, he was able to locate 2 of them. What the Comanches would do at the time is the older captives, they would usually treat them as slaves, but they would use them as fodder for trading. So they would take these people and then trade them with white folks to get what they wanted. A lot of times it would be horses or something else. So Elizabeth Kellogg and Rachel Plummer, his daughter, they were found within a couple of years and returned to their family. And Rachel also wrote down about what happened to her, so another primary source material. Rachel Plummer's narrative of 21 months servitude as a prisoner among the Comanche Indians. It's very, very heartbreaking when you read what happened to her. She had a very different experience than Cynthia Ann Parker had. Cynthia Ann, because she was 8 or 9 at the time, the younger captives, they were sort of adopted into the tribe and treated like family. All indications, although she never wrote down her story, all indications are that she was happy. She had a good life. Rachel did not. She was treated as a slave. She was passed around a couple of times with different families and finally wound up with someone who treated her like a slave. They beat her, starved her, and at the time that she was captured, she was pregnant. So she gave birth while she was living with the Comanches. She was allowed to keep the child for a few weeks, but then it was determined, in her own words, I'm getting this story from, it was determined that the child was taking too much of her time and she was spending too much helping the child or taking care of the child and not enough time doing her chores. So they killed her baby in front of her in a very, very gruesome, violent manner, which she writes in there, and it's very heartbreaking. And not only that, her 2-year-old was with her at the time, so her 2-year-old was also kidnapped. She never saw him again. So she writes a lot in her narrative, always worrying about what happened to James Pratt. Will I ever see James Pratt again? So both of her children one taken from her, never to be seen again, not by her anyway, and the other killed right in front of her. 5 years later, but at this point Rachel Plummer had died. When she was returned to her family, she only lived a year or two, and she passed away. Her son, James Pratt Plummer, was found. He was 9 by this point, and John Parker, Cynthia Ann's brother, was found together. They had both been traded to some whites, and James Parker was able to go get them and bring them back to the family. Now, John Parker, Cynthia Ann's brother, there are a lot of stories about him. Nobody's really sure what happened. You'll hear me talk about this more later, but kids who grew up in the tribe had a hard time assimilating back into their white families. They couldn't remember English anymore. You know, their early memories of their life were gone, so they didn't really, they had a hard time. The story is, like his sister that you'll hear about in a minute, John didn't want to stay with his white family. Nobody really knows for sure what happened to him. Some stories are that he escaped and went back to his Comanche family. Some stories are his mother sent him back to the Comanches. I'm not sure why she would do that. There is a story that she sent him back to the Comanches to Cynthia Ann to try to talk Cynthia Ann into leaving, and she wouldn't do it. That may or may not be true. And other stories are that at some point he met a Mexican woman, they got married, they lived in New Mexico and lived happily ever after, so nobody really seems to know for sure. Cynthia Ann, as I said, had a completely different experience than her cousin Rachel. She was adopted as a child. Her Indian name was Nadua, which means, I've seen 3 different meanings for it, but one is she who keeps warm with us. She lived with them until December 1860. She married one of the chiefs, Peter Nakona. They had 3 children, Quanah, who we'll be talking about in a moment, Pecos, and his nickname was Peanut, and Topsana, and her nickname was Prairie Flower. Quanah means fragrant. Their names usually have some meaning as to what happened at their birth. Quanah apparently means fragrant. His year of birth is guesstimated at 1850 to 1852, and they think he was born in like a field of wildflowers or something like that, which is why he was given the name Quanah. Pecos was supposedly born along the Pecos River, so that's where he got his name. Not sure about where Prairie Flower or Topsana came from. Cynthia Ann was returned to her white family, but not by choice. Confederate General Lawrence Sol Ross and Texas Rangers and other people had been hired by the U.S. government over the years to try to keep the Comanches and other bands of Indians in check so that they weren't doing all of this violence, right? He attacked an Indian encampment, which is mostly women and children again. Again, the men were off doing their thing, and slaughtered everybody who was there. Shot them all on the spot. Cynthia Ann had her 2-year-old daughter with her, Topsana, a Prairie Flower. They were either on foot or on horse, depending on who you believe, was trying to get away and probably would have been shot as well, except she threw up her hands and said something, and they got a good look at her eyes, which were blue. Comanches don't have blue eyes. By this point, you'd think they would be able to spot a white woman, but she really didn't look like a white woman anymore. Her skin was very tan because she'd been living, like leather. She'd been outside for the last 20-some years. Her hair had a lot of buffalo grease in it again. She was supposedly a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl when she was small. Now her hair was dark with buffalo grease. The only thing that they realized was the blue eyes. So they stopped. They said, wait a minute, we think that's a white woman. They didn't shoot her. They took her back, not by her choice. And her uncle Isak, the one who was the first sheriff here in Clark County, they called him up to see if he could identify her. So he went to Camp Cooper, where they took Cynthia Ann and her daughter. They had a hard time trying to figure out if it was her because she wasn't understanding anything they were saying. She didn't know the language. But at some point, he said, speaking to someone else, something about Cynthia Ann. And she said, me, Cynthia Ann. She recognized her name. She didn't recognize anything else they were saying to her. So they figured out that it was her. Isak took her to his cabin which looked like this around the turn of the century anyway, near Birdville, Texas. Here's the iconic photo of Cynthia Ann. There are only 2 photos of her. This one was taken right after she was captured. You can see she has Prairie Flower with her. Prairie Flower was upset. Neither one of them had seen a camera before. They weren't exactly sure what was going on. To calm her down, she was breastfeeding her when the photo was taken. Even though this is a black and white photo, you can kind of tell that her eyes are a little bit lighter and not dark brown like the other Comanches would be. So that was taken in Austin, Texas. Later, Isak did take her with him to court to try to get the courts to give her some sum of money to live on. The story says that she was awarded the money, but she never received it. Of course, the Civil War broke out and all sorts of things happened that prevented her from eventually getting the money. When she went to court, she thought they were there to sentence her to death. She was scared to death. She got up in the middle and tried to run out of the court and was really freaking out because she thought it was some sort of a court-martial type of thing, and they were just trying to decide which way to kill her. They calmed her down, explained that wasn't the case. Meanwhile, living with Isak, things weren't going very well. She didn't want to sleep in a bed. She didn't want to wear, non-Comanche clothes. They were trying to fit her in all the latest styles, and she wasn't the least bit interested. She couldn't speak the language. She kept trying to run away because she was worried about her husband and her 2 boys. She didn't know if they were alive or dead. She wanted to return to her Comanche family, so several times she kept running away and they'd have to keep bringing her back. By this point, of course, Isak and his wife were in their 60s or 70s, so that was a lot to take on for them. So eventually, she lived with her cousins William and Maddie Parker, then later with her brother Silas and his wife Ann, and then finally with her sister Orlana and J.R. O'Quinn. So she moved in just a few years' time, several times, and every time they moved her further east, away from Comanche lands, harder for her to escape. Eventually, she seemed to adapt. Prairie Flower adapted very well, just as Cynthia Ann did when she was adopted into the Comanche tribe. Prairie Flower picked up the language. She seemed to be a happy baby. That was the source of joy for Cynthia Ann, was taking care of her daughter. She did, adapt to some of the white ways, but still was constantly asking her family members, please take me back, I want to go find my family. A lot of them promised that they would, at some point, take her that direction and see if she could find her husband and children. It never happened. Again, they kept putting her off. The Civil War broke out, and this happened and that happened, and it never seemed to be a good time to do it. It never occurred in her lifetime. Then Prairie Flower gets pneumonia or the flu. I've seen 2 different versions of it, but anyway, she gets sick and dies at about age 5, and that's sort of the last straw for Cynthia Ann. She only lives a few years after that. Some say she starved herself to death or just died of grief, or for whatever reason she died. And I have a star next to 1870 because her year of death is reported differently. Her official gravesite does say 1870, and the math seems to work out with other things that we know, so I'm sticking with the date 1870. Now Quanah, what happened to Quanah? Quanah was her oldest. Her other son, Peanut or Pecos, he also died fairly young of illness. Her husband survived that raid where Cynthia Ann was taken, but died a few years later also of illness. But Quanah grew up to be an adult, and he was a very fierce Comanche warrior. He was an orphan, which isn't a good thing when you're in the Comanche tribe because family connections are very important. So he struggled a little bit in finding a place. But all indications are that he showed signs of leadership very early. He was sort of naturally taking over some leadership positions. A lot happens in a short amount of time here, but all along, of course, Comanches and other Indian tribes have been raiding all over Texas and Oklahoma and other places, raping, killing, burning, until there was nothing left. Quanah was well known for, as he grew up, continuing that. Probably he was raiding his own relatives, the Parkers in Texas, although he didn't know it at the time. All during this period, the U.S. government was trying to talk all these different Indian bands into living peacefully on a reservation, and Quanah wasn't going to hear anything of it. When they would have meetings for treaties, he either wouldn't attend at all, or if he did attend, he refused to sign anything. We all know the treaties never accounted for much, because whatever agreement they reached, the U.S. government usually didn't keep their end of the bargain. However, he was very proud later in life to say, I didn't agree to anything. I eventually, when he moved to the reservation, I did so willingly. Nobody made me come here. So he continued. Every time a treaty was broken and things were getting worse for his people, he would get madder. He was getting more and more violent, raiding more and more often, until the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, which was in June of 1874. That seems to be the turning point where Quanah started to change his mind about whether or not he thought his people could survive the way they had been for hundreds of years. Adobe Walls was just an outpost where several buffalo hunters were staying. One of the biggest problems with the Comanches and other Indians is their source of food was disappearing, the bison or the buffalo. The Comanches especially used it for everything, not only their food, but they used it to make their teepees. I mean, they used every piece of the buffalo practically. They found a use for it. So with that constantly disappearing, his people were hungry and starving. One of the treaties, again, was supposed to be that they would stop hunting buffalo, but again, nobody was following it. So they found out these buffalo hunters were staying at Adobe Walls, and Quanah and his band decided to attack. It didn't go well. Over time, they were getting better and better weapons. The buffalo hunters, of course, had really good weapons because they were using them to shoot the bison. All of the tricks that Quanah was able to use in the past weren't really working for him anymore. You know, he used to be known for riding up on his horse and shooting off 3 arrows from his bow and arrow before anybody could load their shotgun. But now you didn't have to get up close to shoot him anymore. They had these long-range shotguns and all this other firepower that was making all of his ways of fighting obsolete. So it didn't go well at the Battle of Adobe Walls. There's a long story about this one. One of them being Quanah, many yards away. Some say 3/4 of a mile. I have a hard time believing that. But there was a sure shot named Billy Dixon at Adobe Walls, and they sort of bet him to take a shot from, they were all boarded up inside the fort, you know, shooting the Indians, picking them off from the perimeter. Quanah's horse was shot out right from under him from a long distance away, and he was wounded at this battle. Billy Dixon supposedly had the shot of his life and shot an Indian and killed him off of his horse from 3/4 of a mile away. Some people dispute whether that really happened. I don't know. But anyway, that seems to be when Quanah had to stop and think. He decided, he told later, he decided that he didn't think his people were going to survive. Another winter was coming up. There wasn't enough buffalo and bison to keep them going. People were starving. Disease was coming in. So finally, peacefully, he walked his people onto the reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1875. There are lots of pictures of Quanah, unlike his mother. That's one. At Fort Sill, just like he did with the Comanches, he was a natural-born leader. Everyone described him that way. So he quickly became influential for his people. He fought for the rights. He traveled to Washington, D.C. a lot. They were trying to turn the Indians into farmers on the reservation. They gave them each a little plot of land and was trying to get them to learn how to farm. The last thing the Comanches wanted to learn how to do was to farm. That wasn't their thing. They didn't know what to do with it. They were just sort of all hanging around doing nothing. Getting some food and things from the government, not very good food. But Quanah figured out a way to make some money on this deal. He became friends with several cattlemen and started leasing their land to cattlemen for grazing rights. So he figured a way around this system. So suddenly, he became very influential. He went to Washington, D.C. a lot, went to the Bureau for Indian Affairs a lot, trying to fight for the rights of his people, became quite rich, not by our standards, but by the Comanche standards. Became friends with Teddy Roosevelt, president, and he was able to adapt to many of the white man's ways. There were 3 things that he wouldn't give up, however. One was his peyote, which he liked to smoke, and what he considered to be his religion. One was his braids. He wouldn't cut his hair, even though he would wear sort of the businessman, white man's business suit of the day, but he wouldn't cut his hair. And the last was his wives. He had 8 wives altogether, but 7 wives at the time that he went onto the reservation. His friends that he got to know in Washington, D.C., the story goes, said to him, "Quanah, you know, this isn't how we do things here. One wife, you can only have one wife." And his response was something like, "Okay, you choose one and you tell the others." They didn't want to do that, so he got to keep his wives. They sort of dropped it after that. As I said, he became pretty influential, and he built this house called Star House. It still stands, although it's falling down, I hear. They're trying to make it into a historical landmark so somebody can fix it up. This was a pretty big house at the time, especially for a Comanche. And he got most of the money from his cattleman friends, who he got to know over the years. They became very good friends. He tried to get money from the government to build the house, didn't work. But his friends, the cattlemen, gave him the money. And he was so impressed with the U.S. military and the sheriffs and the Texas Rangers, and they always had stars on that showed rank or position. And he wanted to show that he had rank or position too, so that's why he put stars on the roof. And it's called Star House. Cache, Oklahoma, and it's still there. So you can see this is a picture of him standing on the porch. He looks like a well-to-do businessman of the time if it wasn't for the braids. Because his father was Comanche and his mother was white, he had gray eyes, again, very different than the other Comanches, and he was a lot taller. Comanches weren't that tall, 5'3", 5'4", most of them, and he was several inches taller than that. So he did stand out among the other people. He was given the title of the last Comanche chief, actually by people in Washington. Of course, like anything else, a lot of the people in his tribe, some really liked the things he was doing for his people, and some thought he was selling out. He really couldn't win. So some people thought he was giving up on his people by building a house and wearing their clothing, and he would send his children to the white schools and did several things to adapt to white life. So it depends on who you ask. Some people thought he did very well and some people didn't. The Comanches don't give titles like chief. And some people were upset that the Washington officials gave him the title of the last Comanche chief. So that was another reason for some of the Comanche tribe not to like him. The story goes, though, here at Star House, he had his own bedroom and each of his 7 wives had a bedroom. He had 25 kids, which isn't really that many kids when you have 7 wives, I think. Anyway, who knows how many grandkids and so forth after that. But the story goes that he never turned anyone away, Comanche or white. If you were hungry, go to the Star House, he would feed you. There would always be teepees set up all over the lawn for people, for Comanches and other Indian tribes who didn't have any place, any land to go. So by the time he died many years later, he really didn't have much left to his name, and the story goes that he gave it all away. He really didn't keep that much for himself. As I said before, became friends with President Teddy Roosevelt. Rode in his inaugural parade, and Teddy would come and visit him at the Star House and go hunting. So this is not a very good picture, but it is a picture. Here's Teddy Roosevelt. Here's Quanah Parker. And a lot of the other people that you see there are the cattlemen that Quanah was such good friends with. But Teddy sat down at his table, he ate, he spent the night. This, I think it's a wolf hunt. One of the exhibits at the library right now is all just about the relationship between Quanah and Teddy Roosevelt. So they became very good friends, which just added to his influence. It's important to note that as soon as he took his people onto the reservation at Fort Sill, one of the first things he did was ask the officials there, "Help me find my mother and my sister." He hadn't forgot about them, although it had been several years. He didn't know what happened to them. He knew what happened to his dad and his brother because he was there. He didn't know what happened to his mother or his sister. So, among various avenues, including one, was he put an ad in newspapers across Texas saying, "I'm trying to find my mother." And some people responded, and he finally found out that by this point, his mother and his sister had died. He found out where they were buried. And he fought for a long time to get permission from the government to move their remains up there with him. He was unsuccessful until his white son-in-law, married to one of his daughters, sort of used his influence. And eventually, he was able to move their remains. This is a bad picture, but it is Quanah Parker looking over what is left of his mother and his sister before he reburied them near Cache, or near his home. In Comanche tradition, it's said that he personally washed every bone before it was reinterred into the ground. One of the other results of his ad in the paper was somebody said, hey, I took a picture of your mom and your sister when they were first captured. So it was the photographer who took that picture I showed you earlier of Prairie Flower breastfeeding. He was very proud to get that picture. This is a picture of him in his bedroom at Star House, and that picture was blown up and framed and put in a place of honor at his home for the rest of his life. And it's told every time people would come to visit, he would show it to them. He was very proud of it. That's another sort of iconic picture of Quanah Parker among all of the photos that there are. So, not too long after he reburied his mother and his sister, he died himself. He had gotten sick on some of his travels. He traveled a lot. He was not shy of publicity. In fact, he liked it. He sought it out. He had just come back, I want to say, from Texas to a festival there where he appeared in his full Comanche chief wear, and by the time he got back, he was pretty ill. So he died shortly after his mom and his sister returned to them, and they were all buried together. That is Quanah's grave as it stands now. Oh, I forgot to say. They were all buried together near his home, Star House, but then in 1957, the U.S. government decided they wanted that land for something else. So we dug all three of them up again, and poor Cynthia Ann and Prairie Flower got buried a third time, but they all are buried together at Fort Sill. That's the first one was Quanah's, that's Cynthia Ann's grave, and that is Prairie Flower's grave, all buried together in Fort Sill. So that's the history. Why are we still talking about this? Why was this story so influential to so many people? That's sort of the legend. Some of it's true, some of it's not true. It's been blown up, of course, as good stories always do. But Quanah and Cynthia Ann Parker have inspired many things, books, movies, plays, all sorts of things. There was an opera from 1939 called Cynthia Parker, an American opera, which I was able to get the lyrics for, but not the music. There's a song called Cynthia Parker and other songs that you could find just by Googling it. There was a comic book detailing Quanah's marriage and elopement with his second wife, Wakia. I've never been able to find it. I would love to see it. But the story about Quanah and Wakia is he had a first wife from another band who wasn't happy living with him, and so they sort of got a Comanche divorce, whatever that's called. And she returned to her family. So Wakia was actually his second, but his longest wife, the wife he had had the longest at the time that he lived at Star House. It's the age-old story. Like I said, Quanah was poor. He was an orphan. He didn't have much. He was in love with Wakia. Wakia's dad said, no, you can't have her. A lot of times, whoever got the girl was whoever had the most horses, because in Comanches, horses were everything. Quanah didn't have very many, so Wakia's dad wanted her to marry somebody else, somebody with a lot of horses. So Quanah and Wakia eloped. But he was smart about it. He was very smart all the time. There were all kinds of stories about how he outsmarted Texas Rangers and U.S. military and everything else in all the many years that they were trying to track him down. Across Texas and Oklahoma, he outsmarted them every single time, which he was proud of and would tell you all about it if you asked him. Anyway, back then, he was also smart. He was very young at the time, but he knew Wakia's dad has a lot of influence. He might take her back. So instead of just eloping with her, he got a lot of his friends to go with him. And, they left, going all different directions so that they couldn't follow the trace of where they ended up, met back at some location, and proceeded to raid every place they could find and stole as many horses as possible. So by the time Wakia's dad found them, he had a huge herd of horses. And Wakia's dad said, okay, you can keep her. And supposedly, those two bands then came together and created, one of the biggest Comanche bands at the time. And there's supposed to be a comic book that details this, but I haven't been able to find it. Larry Gatlin of the Gatlin Brothers wrote a musical called Quanah, the Parker Family Saga. There has been a staged reading in 2010 in New York City, but I haven't been able to find any other trace of it since then. Books. There are millions of books. Okay, not millions, dozens of books. Those three at the top are three of the best well-known nonfiction books. Empire of the Summer Moon is a lot about the Comanche history and Quanah's role in it. Return the Parker story, the one in the middle, is the most recently written nonfiction books. And he is one of the few authors that spends much time on the other Parkers in the family, Benjamin and Nathaniel and everyone else, which is where I got a lot of the information from earlier. And talks about their time in Illinois, which most of the other authors only care about what happened to them when they went to Texas. These are some nonfiction books, and there are many others. Ride the Wind is a very popular one. Killing Cynthia Ann is another. Ride the Wind is a very romanticized story about Cynthia Ann growing up in the Comanche tribe and how she met the love of her life and her future husband. Killing Cynthia Ann is the author's thoughts on what it was like for Cynthia Ann when she was forced to live back with her white family. Part of the reason why the story is so well told is because people are fascinated with the thought behind not wanting to return to civilization. Many people think the tragedy of Cynthia Ann's life wasn't when she was captured and taken to the Comanches, it was when she was recaptured and returned to her white family. That was the real tragedy of her life, because she never wanted to be there. Movies, The Searchers. Anybody seen The Searchers? I knew Dan would have seen it. Anybody else seen The Searchers? Okay, well, it's a John Wayne Western. There are a lot of those. This is my favorite, because I think John Wayne actually gets to show some emotion in this one instead of just being a bad guy. But anyway, The Searchers was first a book and then made into a movie, but it was inspired by James Parker and his search for his kidnapped relatives, and mostly Cynthia Ann, because she's the one that was missing the longest. So John Wayne plays Ethan Edwards, which is a role inspired by James Parker, and Natalie Wood plays Debbie, which is a role inspired supposedly by Cynthia Ann. Now, of course, it's over-romanticized, and a lot of things happen that didn't occur in the true story, including in the movie, John Wayne wants to find his niece so he can kill her, because he thinks she's better off dead, having spent all this time with the Comanches than returning to her white family. So the drama, or some of the drama of the movie is, will he find her? And if he finds her, will he kill her or will he return to the family? And I won't tell you what happened. But that is a lot of the people at the time, not the Parkers, as far as I can tell. They welcomed their captives back with open arms and tried to bring them back to the family. But a lot of people at the time thought, just leave them where they are. We don't want them anymore. They've already been raped, living the Comanche life. They're savages. We don't want them anymore, which is a sad state for them to be in. And some of the captives didn't want to leave, like Cynthia Ann. She was forced to leave. A lot of the others, they were contacted, like Cynthia Ann was when she was younger, offered to buy you and take you back to your Parkers. She said, no, I'll stay where I am. People didn't understand that, which is why it's such a fascinating story. Another John Ford movie, Two Rode Together. Anybody seen that one? Jimmy Stewart. You know who Jimmy Stewart is? It's a Wonderful Life. Have you seen It's a Wonderful Life? Christmas movie? Blank stares. Apparently not. This is Jimmy Stewart. He plays a small town sheriff who is hired by the U.S. military to go see the big bad Indian chief Quanah Parker and negotiate the release of his white captives. So in this movie, Quanah Parker is the bad guy, the guy who has white captives and doesn't want to let them go. And again, it all plays on this same story where Jimmy Stewart finds them, finds some of the people he's looking for, and they say, no, I'm not leaving. Just don't even tell my family you found me because I don't want to go back there. Some of them don't want to go back there because they're ashamed. Some of them don't want to go back there because they want to stay with the Comanche family. And then, of course, there's a love story and all sorts of things that happen in the movie. Dances with Wolves. Have you guys seen Dances with Wolves? I see some nods. The character Stands with the Fist was inspired by Cynthia Ann Parker. And this is a movie that hasn't come out yet, but it was filmed in 2013 in Texas. It's called The Last Comanche Chief, The Second Battle of Adobe Walls. So it is supposed to be all about the Adobe Walls battle and Quanah Parker and what happened there. Every time I check IMDb, it says in development, so I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day, but it's out there anyway. TV characters. I think it was Linda who pointed this out to me. Anybody see Killer Women on ABC a year ago at this time? January, February 2014. Linda saw it and told me about it. Unfortunately, it only lasted 8 episodes and it was canceled. So it was canceled before I knew about it and I didn't get to see it. The description centers on Molly Parker, one of only 2 women in the notoriously male Texas Rangers. So we all heard earlier that Cynthia Ann's dad Silas and her uncle James were some of the first original Texas Rangers. Molly Parker is a female Texas Ranger in this show, and according to the ABC website, her character, it was described like this. A native Texan, Molly is descended from Cynthia Ann Parker, the 9-year-old American girl adopted by a Comanche warband after it massacred her family's settlement in 1836. So even today, people are fascinated by this story. I think I saw on ABC that you could pay like $2 to watch the episodes, so I'm going to do that to see what that was like. A couple of other movies I want to mention, not because they're about the Parkers, because it includes the Parkers. The first is Daughter of Dawn, which we showed here in this room on Saturday afternoon. It's a silent movie, shot in 1920, shown once, and then it disappeared until about 2008. So there were records of it, and they knew this movie had been shot. Nobody knew what happened to it until a private investigator on the East Coast, the story goes. Someone had hired him to do a job, and the guy couldn't pay him, so in lieu of payment, he gave him this film that he had in his attic. Turned out the film was Daughter of Dawn. The private investigator sold it to the Oklahoma Historical Society, who has now restored it. But why do we care? We care because 2 of Quanah Parker's children star in this movie. This is White Parker, who has the male lead. His sister, Quanah Parker, is also in it. It's a love story triangle, kind of similar to Quanah and Wikia's story, actually. These 2 love each other. Her dad says no, she wants him, wants his daughter to marry somebody else. And it's actually a love square because there's a 4th person. Everybody loves the wrong person. Anyway, silent movie. Film buffs think it's great because not only is it just a really rare silent movie that was just found, it was also, I'm going to have to read this to you, the Library of Congress in 2013 named this movie to the National Film Registry because it represents important cultural, artistic, and historic achievements in filmmaking. What was important about it at the time, remember this was shot in Oklahoma in 1920, is it didn't really include any actors. These are real Indians. They used their real teepees, their real horses, their real clothing. They signed up to make this movie, shot them doing a buffalo hunt and the whole deal. And so that is historic among filmmakers for that reason, so it's gotten a lot of attention. The second one is called The Bank Robbery. Quanah Parker himself stars in this film. Like I said, he didn't shy away from public spotlight. 1908, you can watch it online. Just type in The Bank Robbery, you'll find it. It's really, really poor quality, but it's significant because it's called the first 2 real Western movie ever made. And again, he plays a good guy. He's in a suit. He doesn't play an Indian in the film. That's it. I just wanted to mention who our sponsors were for this whole series. One being the Illinois Humanities Council, who gave us a grant to do these programs, and that's why I'm going to give you a short little survey to fill out in a minute. Tarbell Arts Center, which, as you guys know, in addition to having an exhibit going on there right now, they're helping us with the 5th grade program. After the students, or before the students spend some time with you over in the library, they'll be doing a related art activity over the Tarbell, something to do with Southwest Indian art, so they'll tie that all together. And the Texas Lakes Trail is a historic group in Texas who loaned us all of the photos of Cynthia Ann and Quanah that you just saw here, and that's on display at the library right now. And just so you know, those are the 3 sources that most of the information from this PowerPoint came from. That's all I have. What kind of questions do you have? if any? We're good? Okay.